The Russia-Ukraine war has never been confined to those two countries alone. But only in recent weeks has it become clear just how far it is spilling across Europe. Russian drones over Poland, UAVs over Denmark and Norway, Kremlin MiG-31s in Estonian airspace, explosions in the UK. Moscow is showing it is ready to spread chaos far beyond Ukraine's borders. But is this a show of strength or, paradoxically, of weakness? The Russian bear is bleeding, literally oil and gasoline. Ukrainian drones are setting refineries, terminals and pipelines ablaze. The fuel crisis is hitting the daily lives of millions of Russians, while the Kremlin is forced to raise taxes and openly admit that the 2026 budget is in fact a war budget. At the very same moment, Donald Trump, until recently reluctant to back Kyiv, suddenly talks about Ukraine regaining all its territory. What has changed? Are we witnessing yet another turning point in this war? In recent weeks, we have seen a steady escalation of Russian hybrid attacks against NATO countries. These attacks did not begin yesterday, but ever since Russian drones crossed into Polish territory, the tempo has clearly intensified. Let's trace the events chronologically. The starting point, the morning of September 10th, when around 24 Russian UAVs violated Polish airspace. This was a deliberate strike, using drones fitted with extended fuel tanks. The goals were clear: to test NATO's readiness, to gauge its willingness to respond decisively, and to force the alliance to expand costly interceptor missiles. One residential home was destroyed, likely from debris from a missile intercept. Poland invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, and in response, the alliance launched Operation Eastern Sentry, redeploying several fighter jets and a frigate to the region. A week later came the next provocation. On September 19th, two Russian MiG-31s, flying without transponders or filed flight plans, violated Estonian airspace for a full 12 minutes. They were intercepted by Italian F-35s. Tallinn also invoked Article 4. That same day, Russian aircraft, possibly the same ones, buzzed the Polish Petro-Baltic oil platform, breaching its designated safety zone within Poland's exclusive economic area, and signaling its vulnerability to Russian strikes. Barely 3 days later, on September 22nd, airports in Copenhagen and Oslo were paralyzed by the appearance of Russian rotor drones overhead. This turned out to be just the opening act of a broader hybrid campaign against Denmark. In the days that followed, drones reappeared over airports and military bases in Aalborg, Holstebro, Billund, Esbjerg, Skrydstrup, Sonderborg, and once again, Copenhagen. The Danish military noted that during a previous incident near the country's territorial waters, a large Russian Navy landing ship had been spotted. Quote, "It is a hybrid war that we are seeing unfold on Danish soil, as we also see in other European countries. We see cyber attacks, hacking attacks, drones, and then sabotage. I believe we have only seen the beginning of the attacks that are coming," said Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen in the aftermath. And the continuation did not take long. On September 24th, a massive explosion rocked Swindon in the UK. Just 9 days after Britain's Ministry of Defense had announced the construction of the country's largest drone factory, located at that very site. There is no doubt that all these incidents share a single common denominator: the Russian Federation. The Kremlin has decided it is time to intensify operations beyond the formal threshold of war, across NATO's eastern flank and beyond. The aim is not only to test readiness, but also to sow panic among local populations, expose the vulnerability of key infrastructure, and simply showcase the reach of Russia's spy networks and saboteurs. On the NATO side, the response was marked by the usual restraint, though as so often Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, proved the most hawkish. After violations of Estonian and Polish airspace, Sikorski indirectly threatened to shoot down Russian jets, warning that Moscow should not, quote, whine when deliberately or by mistake Russian aircraft enters NATO airspace, gets shot down, and its wreckage ends up on NATO soil. He later underscored that line by pointing to Donald Trump's support for such a scenario. Sweden's defense minister, Paul Jonsson, was somewhat more cautious, but still emphasized that Sweden will use force if necessary. These strikes against Europe may, in part, be rooted in the pain Russia itself has been suffering over the past 2 months, ever since Ukraine launched its campaign of long-range strikes on Russian refineries. That campaign is still ongoing. To update, since our last report on this front, the Salavat refinery was hit a second time shortly after the initial strike. Refineries in Saratov and Novokubishevsk were also targeted, with the latter reportedly forced to shut down operations. The Apfitsky refinery in Krasnodar Krai was struck for a third time. What's more, Ukraine also hit the massive gas condensate plant in Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea, one of the largest of its kind in the world, and Russia's top sulfur producer. That facility too was forced to suspend operations. In the Volgograd region, successful attacks struck 2 oil pumping stations, Kuzimchi 1, part of the pipeline network feeding Russia's southern regions, and Zenzevatka, which pushes crude along the Kubyshev-Tikhoretsk line. In addition, strikes have hit Russian ports, logistics hubs, and export terminals. The impact on Russia's fuel logistics is growing sharper by the week. Shortages, especially of gasoline, are now being felt across nearly the entire economy. This map, updated by Stanimir Dobrev, shows Russian regions by the date when fuel supply problems were first recorded. Even Moscow is now beginning to see signs of strain, though it is the more poorly connected regions that face the worst shortages, such as Nizhny Novgorod or primarily occupied Crimea, where as many as half of all gas stations have been shut down. Naturally, prices are rising as well, by as much as 30% in some regions in just a matter of weeks. The shortages have already forced Moscow to extend its ban on gasoline exports until 2026, while also introducing a partial ban on diesel exports through the end of this year. A major blow given how vital diesel is for the Russian budget. The sums are enormous. In August alone, petroleum product exports were worth an average of $170 million per day. Following that, the Kremlin is reportedly considering raising value-added tax from 20% to 22%. The relentless strikes on Russia's fuel sector and the disruptions now visible to the naked eye are prompting analysts to assess the broader impact of these attacks, not only on the war itself, but on the functioning of the Russian state as a whole. Prominent independent Russian analyst Władysław Inozemtsev, labeled by the Kremlin as a foreign agent, puts it bluntly: the Ukrainians have identified the perfect target. He points out that Russia's refining industry, the third largest in the world after the United States and China, remains overwhelmingly geared toward producing diesel fuel. This is a legacy of the Soviet era, when refining was focused on heavy transport and energy needs, railways, trucks, and the military. Today, Russia refines 5.5 times more diesel, 225 million tons, than gasoline, 41 million tons. In practice, Russian gasoline output barely covers domestic consumption. Refineries produce a wide range of products, but far less gasoline than diesel, and the sites now hit, the so-called Samara cluster of Novokubishevsk, Syrzan, and Kubyshev, along with Ryazan and Kirishi, form the very core of Russia's gasoline production. That is why Inozemtsev predicts that gasoline crisis will last for at least several months. He adds that oil companies can do little to mitigate the damage, with repairs likely to drag on for months, because Russia lacks the specialized machinery needed for quick fixes. At the same time, he is skeptical about the strike's impact on Russia's war logistics, largely diesel-based, or on budget revenues from hydrocarbon exports. Even if refined product exports fall, Russia can still export crude oil. According to Inozemtsev, the most significant consequence of Ukraine's campaign is therefore psychological, the discomfort experienced by, quote, ordinary Russians. And he considered this the most severe of all wartime inconveniences so far, greater than inflation, problems with the internet and communications, or disrupted air travel. In short, Inozemtsev tempers the more optimistic pro-Ukrainian narratives. Still, his analysis assumes that Kyiv may eventually slow its attacks as it did last year. For now, however, there is no sign of this campaign ending. On the contrary, Ukraine is diversifying its targets. Beyond refineries, it has now struck export terminals in Ust-Luga, Primorsk, and most recently, Novorossiysk, facilities that may prove even more critical when it comes to budget revenues. In contrast to Inozemtsev's cautious assessment, Ukraine's chief of the general staff, Oleksandr Syrsky, insists that the fuel crisis in Russia is already directly impacting the logistics of its army. According to Ukraine's top commander, in less than 2 months, Kyiv has successfully struck 85 high-profile targets inside Russia. Beyond refineries, these include arms factories, military bases, and airfields. Most recently, Ukraine hit the Molkino base in Krasnodar, destroying Iskander missile systems and Pantsir S-1 air defenses. 2 An-26 transport aircraft were also taken out in the recent wave of strikes. Russian meal bloggers, for their part, are far less restrained. Some see conspiracy everywhere, claiming refinery owners actually welcome the attacks since they drive up prices and inflate their wealth. An argument pushed by one blogger known as Ramzai. Meanwhile, Dmitry Steshin of Komsomolskaya Pravda thundered that fuel shortages could ultimately bring down the regime itself. Pressure on Russian oil is now greater than at any point since the start of the war. And other factors are compounding the squeeze internationally. Russian crude still flows via the Shadow Fleet, mainly to buyers in China and India. Moreover, countries like India and Turkey continue to buy Russian crude, refine it, and then resell the products to Europe, profiting twice over. Brussels is slowly moving to close this sanctions loophole as well. In July, the EU lowered the price cap on Russian crude to $47.6 per barrel, though it left the cap on Russian diesel untouched at $100. At the same time, it is considering a ban on refined products made from Russian oil. Combined with Ukraine's strikes on refineries, and perhaps more importantly, on export terminals, this could deal a far heavier blow to the Kremlin's export potential. Taken together, these developments point toward what Ukrainians might cautiously call a reversal of the trend. The front has stabilized, including the patching of the gap near Dobropilya. Ukraine also inflicts the single most damaging blow to Russia's economy since the war began, through its campaign of deep strikes on the hydrocarbon sector. And on top of all that, for the first time since the full-scale invasion began, none other than Donald Trump has spoken positively about Ukraine's chances of victory. Quote, "After getting to know and fully understand the Russia-Ukraine military and economic situation, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form," Trump wrote on Truth Social. This marks a complete reversal of his previous rhetoric. Statements such as, quote, "You don't have the cards," or, quote, "You should have never started the war. You could have given up land." Lines Trump not long ago directed at Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. Of course, trying to divine Trump's motives for this sudden shift is little more than guesswork. Some point to his personal disappointment with Putin. Others argue that Ukraine's strikes on refineries and bombers have raised its stature in Trump's eyes. There is speculation too about an upcoming Ukrainian offensive. Not insignificantly, Kyiv is also preparing a $90 billion procurement request for the Pentagon, on top of Europe's steady stream of orders, all driven by Russian imperialism. Some even claim that King Charles himself played a role in swaying Trump. From Kyiv's perspective, the only sensible approach is to keep a cool head. If there is one constant in Trump's presidency, it is volatility. Still, this shift is anything but trivial. If Trump has genuinely changed his stance on Ukraine, then the change of trend we spoke of earlier might not just flatten, it could actually swing in Ukraine's favor. One sign that this is more than empty rhetoric came with Washington's long-awaited approval for long-range Ukrainian strikes. In other words, the US is no longer objecting to Kyiv's campaign against Russian refineries, a stance that is far from self-evident. Russia should not have sanctuaries, confirmed Kyiv Kellogg on Fox News. That shift could carry even greater implications. Shortly after Kyiv received the green light, a power plant in Bielgorod went up in flames. Why is this significant? Because Bielgorod lies within range of US-supplied ATACMS missiles. It is unclear whether ATACMS were used in the strike, but disabling such a facility with drones alone would be difficult, given the density of Russian air defenses near the border. That's not all. Washington and Kyiv are now openly discussing the possibility of selling Ukraine Tomahawk cruise missiles. The news was confirmed by none other than J.D. Vance, one of the administration figures traditionally least sympathetic to Ukraine. The Tomahawk is among the deadliest weapons in America's arsenal, with a warhead of up to half a ton and a range of up to 2,500 kilometers. Depending on the variant, it is in a different league entirely. Ukraine is currently launching hundreds of drones over Russia, most of which are intercepted. The ongoing fuel crisis has been triggered by the handful that managed to hit their targets. Tomahawks, however, are exponentially harder to shoot down. Their deployment would lift Ukraine's strike campaign to a level that so far has been unattainable. Domestic designs, like the FP5 Flamingo or the Long Neptune, remain in early development stages, while Kyiv needs results here and now. Back in late June, we sketched out 3 possible scenarios for how the war might evolve. The one scenario that seemed the most far-fetched at the time was the idea of Trump making a full pro-Ukraine pivot, reshaping the war's trajectory back in Kyiv's favor. Yet just 3 months later, that perception has shifted again. Russia is suffering from a cascade of problems, small and large, which taken together amount to structural decline. One of the latest setbacks was Moscow's electoral defeat in Moldova, where the Kremlin poured significant resources in an effort to derail the country's pro-European course. Instead, Maya Sandu's Action and Solidarity Party, PAC, secured an outright majority. Perhaps it is precisely this sense of vulnerability that drives Moscow toward preemptive moves and hybrid attacks, like the recent incidents in Poland, Estonia, Denmark, and Norway. The Russian Federation keeps charging ahead on sheer momentum, but the train's rusting shell only hides the deeper rot in its engine. Until now, the switchman, Donald Trump, has watched with a kind of detachment, even as the runaway train crushed everything in its path. Perhaps only now is he ready to pull the lever, derailing it completely.